I gave a reading somewhere, and during the Q&A, a woman stood up and said to me, "My daughter wants to be a playwright, but I know how incredibly hard it is to make it as a playwright, especially as a woman, but for anyone. What should I tell her?" And I said, "Well, is she talented?" And she said, "Yes, very." And I said, "Well, is this something she absolutely wants to do?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I think you should tell her that's wonderful, because the world will whittle your daughter down, but a mother never should." And my mother never did. And I find that that is feminism in action, very much at home.
To the Harbour Grace excursion with novelist
Books really saved my life.
This is your 12th novel, and you've been writing about a lot of these sort of themes and issues throughout your work. How has this book tour been different, though, because of what's been happening?
Yeah, I just finished about a month on the road in the U.S. for this novel, and one of the questions that I get asked a lot is about the Me Too movement and the relationship of this novel to that. And somebody asked me, "Did you start writing it after that began?" I mean, look at how long it is.
400.
I would have had to have gotten like a whole group of people in one room, and they would each take a different chapter, and we'd say go.
Right.
Because some of the ideas in this book around female power, misogyny, making meaning in the world, are things that I've been thinking about, and we've all been thinking about, I'm sure, for a very long time. I think what's happened in the Me Too movement is that the conversation, of course, has been sharpened and articulated and gotten louder. But the idea that I have a sort of Cassandra-like ability to know what people are going to talk about isn't true. I mean, if you look at, in fact, my body of work, there's these themes really run through it, if some of you know my other novels.
Well, when if the position, for example, is about forgiveness and what parents owe their children, the interesting is, I remember you telling me that it was sort of, you wanted to look at what happens to talent over time.
Yeah.
What was the idea or the phrase that you started with for this book?
When I write a novel, I love to have what I consider kind of a problem that I'm thinking about. It's not a theme, but it's a problem that I want to explore. And there were a few here. I would say that the first one was female power. What is it? What's the ambivalence around it? How do we deal with it? Does it look different from power in men? Ambition, which is something that I've really explored a lot in my work, definitely is here. But also a new strand, which is making meaning in the world. But what put it all together really was this idea about a person you might meet when you're young who sees something in you and changes your life. And that, to me, made it a novel rather than a pamphlet, about different ideas. And I set sail with nothing but that. And as I began to write, immediately I saw this young woman, Greer Kadetsky, my protagonist, who is in college at the beginning of the novel, and there's an assault. She's groped at a frat bar. Have some of you read the book? I'm going to have to ask the rest of you to leave. She's groped at a frat party, and the college responds very poorly. And the famous feminist Faith Frank comes to speak. And Faith is, I love the alliteration of famous feminist Faith Frank. She was famous back in the 70s, really, when she was an editor of Bloomer magazine. And she's described as being 2 or 3 steps down from Gloria Steinem. And Greer wants to go see her and just sort of say, what do we do? More generally, not just about this, but about that feeling. And Faith sees something in her. And when I saw Greer as this person who couldn't speak up, well, almost naturally, Faith became someone who could. So that sort of, I began and I ran with that.
Was there a particular friction that because this is second and fourth wave feminism,
Yeah.
right? And there's so many waves to choose from
Yeah.
that, was there a particular friction between those two that intrigued you?
I think the media certainly loves a cat fight. and talks about it between the generations. There is legitimate friction and between generations in so many movements. But I don't want to give too much away, but something around ideas of compromise comes out in the book. And Greer hasn't been around long enough to experience that, a moment when she might be asked to compromise, and what would she do based on that?
There's one of the characters who really stuck with me anyway is Corey. Because we can't have a conversation about understanding, or we can, but conversations about female ambition, we have to understand the male ambition and toxic masculinity, which his journey really helped me get into and understand in a way. I mean, he's sort of he's a nice guy who's sort of challenged by different incarnations of toxic masculinity throughout his young adulthood.
Yeah.
Where did he come from?
So, it's a kind of dual love story, I realize. And you don't always know what you're writing. I mean, I like to write kind of blindly. Are some of you fiction writers or want to be? Some of you? Yeah, okay. I don't know how. I like to just sort of write with a great freedom at the beginning, and characters kind of form out of the sludge in some way. And Corey was one of those. It became a double love story because when Greer meets Faith, the person who sees you, if you think about that in your own life, if you had someone when you were young who paid attention to you, someone maybe older, did some of you have that? Yeah, right? I mean, it could be an employer or a friend or someone you just meet who notices something in you. It's a kind of falling in love in a way when that person sees something in you, you get very excited. But she also has this boyfriend, and Greer's mother describes them as being twin rocket ships. They're going to go really far. And their trajectory is different from that. I just loved him. In the interestings, the male character, Ethan Figman, I feel you have to kind of love your characters in some way. But I felt both of their vulnerability in some sense. And he's trying to be a sort of sexual, powerful male in the world, Corey is. And he's following some of the rules, and he realizes that they may not be right for him. And there's a moment that people ask me about in the book, when Greer's mother says he's a real feminist. So it begs the question, what is a feminist? What does it mean to be a feminist? And there's a friend, the best friend in the book, there's a big betrayal and a kind of argument. And she has a line where she says, I think there are two kinds of feminists, the famous ones and everyone else. And I kind of meant, when I think about Corey, the people who just quietly get up and do the right thing. And he, to me, is one of those people.
Well, and there's that whole aspect of the women's, I mean, again, it's hard because I don't want to
know,
give
you
things
have
away.
to thread a needle.
The women's work
Yeah.
that he engages in.
When you're talking about a book and some people have read it and others haven't, you thread this needle very carefully. You don't want to bore much of the audience or alienate some of the, but so we'll kind of like speak in clues and
completely coded.
I'll use puppets at some point.
But you do drop, I mean, it's there in the third or fourth paragraph of the first
Yes.
chapter. You do drop a little.
Well, I want
there.
Okay. So I was really on the fence about this. Right at the end of the break, right at the very beginning of the first chapter, I say it would be a very long time before the unspeakable end. That's the line you're referring to, I assume. So that we know that there's an unspeakable end. I usually don't write in that way, which is kind of what I describe as the little did she know school of writing, because I don't want to overdetermine it, and yet it's a long novel, and I wanted to anchor the fact that this relationship, which is already so imbalanced, it's really between a mentor and a protege. And the thing about that relationship generally is that it's going to have to change a little bit in order for it to be in a novel. And I wanted to let the reader know that's going to happen. Although it was interesting, the other night I did an event, and I asked the audience if they all were aware of that line as they were reading it, or if they'd forgotten it. And a number of them really had not kind of remembered it throughout the book. although I think a kind of innate remembering happens when things are planted. You don't have to remember it overtly, but when something happens, the unspeakable end, I think something clicks in the reader's mind and they remember that they had been told that.
And you file it away.
Yeah.
You create, I mean, in various novels, you create these worlds where they're sort of very much, they're familiar, they're very much like ours, and yet not. Like I think of
Right.
In the Wife, it's not the Nobel Prize, it's the Helsinki Prize, which is a Nobel-like thing.
Yeah.
There's, I want to say his name is Holt. There's a sort of...
Holt Rayburn, yeah.
Holt Rayburn, a Philip Roth type character. And why do you make them kind of real-world adjacent? Like what's behind that choice?
Oh, real world adjacent, RWA. I'm going to start like turning that into a new acronym. My son said to me, Mom, I think you write novels just so you can make up the names of things that don't really exist in the world.
There's got to be some fun in it. I mean, just as an example, there's Femme Fatale, which is sort of like a provocative feminist blog. And
Yeah, and the magazine that Faith was an editor of is called Bloomer, after Amelia Bloomer, the reformer and publisher. And she is described as 2 or 3 steps down from Gloria Steinem. Well, I want to live in a world in which there are a number of famous feminists, so we can have, so you have to create one. I guess I feel that what happens in a novel, and this is maybe speaking a little more generally to the novel and the project of the novel, I think what happens in a novel is what actually happened and what might have happened. And I think that the kind of Venn diagram overlap between those things has, to me, to my thinking, a kind of pleasing fictional landscape creation about it. I want to put in real things, but I want to be free to put in things that are made up. And the thing is, when they are real, like for instance, if you're writing about a publication that exists, you kind of owe it to the publication not to go farther than what it did do. And I want it to go far. I don't like to be held back. Mm-hmm. So if you make up characters, I mean, that's why making up characters whole cloth is so satisfying. For those of you who write, so that people who write historical fiction, and you can only go so far with a character. You cannot have Virginia Woolf going on a crime spree, although now you can with those zombie books and all of that, right? I want to be free. So that's why I do the RWA.
But there is an element of RWA. We're going to have TM. There's an element of compositing, though. I mean, there's the 71 debate with Germaine Greer and stuff. And there's sort of a... I was so... Like, Gloria Steinem appears, like she's mentioned.
Yeah, it's not her.
And it's not her. And yet...
my parents were at Town Hall, because that's what you're... So
wow, okay.
Yeah, so there was a film, a Pennybaker documentary called Town Bloody Hall, which was a documentary about this incredible evening when feminism was like this sizzling hot new thing in New York City at Town Hall, and Norman Mailer was on stage debating the women, and Germaine Greer and Jill Johnston, a writer who was a lesbian writer for the Village Voice, and he was so obnoxious, and it was the place to be. And my parents, living on Long Island, like drove into the city to be at this thing, and I loved that they were there.
I didn't. Okay, so it wasn't a jar, though. I mean, your character gets gets jars sent to her.
No,
for the
I
one-liner.
made that all up. That's all completely made up. I promise.
Do people ever? Are there things that recur when you meet people who've read your books in that way, at all?
What do you mean?
Like not gifts, but things that
do
come
I
up.
get gifts from people?
The main Faith Frank has a one-liner
Yeah.
that generates a certain amount of memorabilia that people that have seen her talk send her for her whole life.
I get a lot of books. I don't get really locks of hair or that sort of thing. But
jars of beets.
No, not yet. Not as of yet.
There's sort of an assumption that smart women of a certain age, sort of we know everything about feminism and the history of American feminism. But I'm curious, is there research that you did for the landscape that you create? Because I think a lot of people assume that there wouldn't be. Everyone just knows everything.
No, I mean, I'm not big on research just as a rule. I was so bad in it and in making outlines as a child. I remember I had to write things like, I would write an outline. The Greeks, 1, what they wore, B, what they ate. Like, I didn't understand what you were even meant to do. So when I sat down to do research, I realized that much of my research was, of course, talking to people over time, the conversations I've had. I mean, I grew up as long as I can remember, thinking of myself as a feminist. My mother was someone who was very affected by second wave feminism. Her life was really changed by it. Well, so my mother is a novelist, Hilma Wolitzer, who's 88 and writing, and is just brilliant. And she is someone whose parents didn't think it was important for her to go to college. So she was really self-educated, very much. And she started publishing short stories in the 60s. If you remember the old Saturday Evening Post, which published excellent fiction. Like back then, women's magazines were amazing. Like they published serious literary fiction. Red Book magazine. On one page, you could have a recipe for a Jell-O mold, and on a facing page, a story by Alice Munro or Joyce Carol Oates. It was incredible. It was a really golden age of fiction. It was really a different time. So my mother was just encouraged by other women, do this, and she wrote very freely. And it came from some place in her that she hadn't been told was okay to do. And actually there was a detail that I used in the interestings that kind of sums up what I think I got from her. It did come from my life. I gave a reading somewhere, and during the Q&A, a woman stood up and said to me, "My daughter wants to be a playwright, but I know how incredibly hard it is to make it as a playwright, especially as a woman, but for anyone. What should I tell her?" And I said, "Well, is she talented?" And she said, "Yes, very." And I said, "Well, is this something she absolutely wants to do?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I think you should tell her that's wonderful, because the world will whittle your daughter down, but a mother never should." And my mother never did. And I find that that is feminism in action, very much at home. So I got a lot really at home. I was in a consciousness raising group. I feel like when I use that phrase, I'm talking about the butter churn or the 8-track tape deck, right?
Yeah.
And I remember we got together. We were like in 9th grade, or as you say, grade 9, I've come to learn. And like, you know, somebody's mother would be lurking around, and like the girl whose house it was would say, "Mom, go away." And then we would talk very freely and intensely. And I remember it so fondly. We wrote away to the National Organization for Women asking for a list of topics. And they sent us a list that was so not for us. It was like sexual fulfillment and you.
That's where the position comes from,
yeah,
right?
very much, very much. So I remember being very excited by the idea of feminism. And I had women who I would consider, looking back, my mentors, but I only understood that later. But I have friends who are very distinguished feminists. One of them, the writer Katha Pollitt, if some of you know her work, she's a columnist for The Nation and really brilliant. She was really instrumental in the development of so many things in this novel. I talked to different women who were historians and asked them very targeted questions about the history of abortion in America. So I really got the information I needed. But I'm a novelist, and what I love to do, I mean, I'm not writing nonfiction. I never wanted to feel like a tract in any way. The idea of invention, as somebody said of the novel, what we remember of the novels we love isn't plot but character, and I think that's absolutely true. I think and I hope that what you take away from this novel is maybe those 3 or 4 characters.
Well, getting back to your mother, she's one of, I think, 8 dedicatees of the book.
Yep.
There are a few, I mean, some names that are familiar, that might be more or less familiar. There's Mary Gordon, and there's Nora Ephron. Can you tell us a little bit about why they're at the front of the book and your relationship with them? Yeah,
so there are these 8 women, and a few of them are novelists, Rosalind Brown and Mary Gordon, and Nora Ephron, the writer and director. And the dedication of a novel is like the icing on a cake. I know people who come up with the dedication before they write the book, which I think is sort of putting the cart before the horse. As a child, I would come up with names of things. I had a journal of the names of streets, and I thought I could sell this one day. It would be like Greenwood Court. That didn't happen.
like nail polish naming or something.
Nail polish
right? Yeah,
naming, yes,
which is the best.
right? Is that a thing? NPN?
Okay, yeah. RWD.
I did not, of course, come up with the list of these dedicatees until after I wrote the book. But what I realized after the book was how much I had been steeped throughout the book in the idea of mentorship. And again, which, as I said, we don't think about necessarily that way, but the idea of someone who sees you. And I realized that there were a number of women who had been really encouraging to me when I was young, and they didn't have to be. They absolutely didn't have to be, but they were. And I'll talk a little bit about Nora Ephron, because I think that that's one that was really pivotal here. So Nora Ephron's first film that she directed was called This Is My Life, and it was based on a novel that I wrote. And it's a really obscure film. It's now streaming on different platforms, but for a long time it wasn't available. But people who have seen it really love it. Has anyone here seen it? Okay, excellent. And it's with, some of you know it. When I say what it's about, then usually they're like, yeah, right. Julie Kavanagh is a stand-up comic, and her two daughters, Gabby Hoffman and Samantha Mathis. Now, yeah. And it's a charming film that she got made by a studio, because she really went around getting this movie made. And she included me in the project of getting it made. And it was so exciting for me. Like, I was pregnant with my first child, and I remember she wanted me to come to a comedy club, she and her sister Delia, who co-wrote it with her. But it was the last night of my Lamaze class, and I was this goodie. I was like, I can't go. And she was like, I'll tell you what they were going to teach you. And this is over the phone. And then she went, so I went with her, and childbirth was really hard. I think it would have been so easy if I had gone. That's what I'm convinced of. And one of the things that she gave me over the years really was, she was someone of taste and opinions, and she was really an enthusiast. So if she liked your work or liked you, you felt special in some way. And there's something in the book about people who give you permission. And I think she was definitely one of those people. And it wasn't just me. She was so excited about a lot of people, particularly young women writers, and changed their lives in different ways. And one of the areas, I think, was around humor, because there's something about being a novelist and being a literary novelist that we want our novelists to have real gravitas on the page, but then when they get up there, we want them to be funny. But there's a real disconnect between those things. And I think that the project of being funny is a serious one in fiction, because being funny on the page is very, very different from being funny if I get up here. And I'll just give you a little example from something in the book that I wistfully thought about Nora, and I thought she would have liked this detail. I don't know if she would have liked this detail, but trying to channel her, I think, maybe. In trying to create the character of Greer, who I described as very shy, but filled with ideas, but she's stuck as a child, not being in the place she wants to be. So there's a moment in grade school when she's sitting on the floor of the classroom, beneath the whiteboard, eating a can of Pringles with the weird girl in the class. She doesn't belong there, but she can't ask for what she needs yet. She hasn't met Faith Frank yet. And this weird girl, I didn't need to put this exchange in, but it populated the world a little more. This girl says to her, "Do you ever think about poisoning our teacher?" And Greer says, "No." And the girl says, "Yeah, neither do I." And it's a throwaway, and it's a punchline, and yet it isn't, because it shows you the stuff that you kind of put up with before you find the place you're meant to be. And I realized that, so humor in that situation serves a very big function. It inflates the character with life. And I think that that's what humor in fiction can do.
Well, very funny and all. I mean, there's a lot of sort of chortling I chortle in your novels.
Okay.
In some ways it's.
But did
there's-
you guffaw, Natalie?
guffaw?
I was
chortle,
hoping for guffaws.
Chortling with glee.
Knee slapping. I don't know. You're
Because-
saying chortling. All right.
There's stuff that's funny because it's true. It's hard, and there's a sort of sharp edge to
Yeah.
it. And you wrote about a stand-up. I mean, This Is Your Life or This Is My Life.
Yeah.
I can't remember what
It was originally This Is Your Life, yeah.
is about a stand-up
comic.
comic, a female stand-up comic.
Yeah.
And so, you sort of studied it early on that way,
Yeah.
I suppose. Can we talk about the movies that get, and the TV things
Sure.
that get made a little bit? Because again, I don't want to, there's a lot in the book, but we don't want to give it away.
Yeah.
But your job is a novelist, but there's an afterlife for a number of your books. The one you mentioned, there's Mike Newell did the
The
pilot for
Interestings,
The
yeah.
Interestings.
It did not get picked up on Amazon. I don't know if some of you saw it.
But watch it. And then the big news for this book, for the female persuasion, is that actually it's the same producer, Linda
Yeah.
Obst, and Nicole Kidman, optioned and in theory
She's
will
gonna star
play
and
as
play
Faith
Faith
Frank
Frank,
with
yeah.
the boots and the tall boots.
Yes.
What is it that you hope as a novelist for the afterlife in these movies when they get made?
Well, there's sort of two questions in there. The afterlife of a book, but the movie of a book. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that they're
Right. Oh, and The Wife. I'm sorry. I want to
Yeah,
mention The Wife because it's out in August.
yes,
With
yes.
Glenn Close.
It had its world premiere at the Toronto Film Festival, actually, and that was really exciting. I came for that. It got the gala premiere at the festival. And did anyone see it? Yeah. My publicist.
August 10th
yes.
here in Canada.
August 10th?
It's August 10th. They've confirmed the date.
It's
so.
fantastic. Glenn Close and Jonathan Pryce, and they're really amazing, and that was really exciting. So that one, for instance, it took 15 years for it to come out. It took like 13 years to get made. So that's a labor of love. The screenwriter, Jane Anderson, won the Emmy for Olive Kitteridge, if some of you saw that. It was on HBO. And I think the kind of films that can get made of my books, or at least so far, they're because they're character-based and often with women and don't have asteroids or much possibility for a cartoon franchise.
Right.
Although now I'm kind of thinking of this one as a cartoon series. Hey, Faith. I don't know.
Broadcast News meets Heathers
They're kind of right
in high school, the high school
right.
times. Yeah.
Not going to happen. They're going to be a different kind of film. They're going to be the kind of films that we like to watch, I think. But they take a while to get made sometimes because they're not always big budget movies. But they can have wonderful actors in them. And I think with Nicole Kidman in it, it can be a big budget, wonderful film. I have we'll see what happens. I love it. For me, it's really enjoyable you go to the set and they have to be nice to you and they show you the food on the table, craft services, and you get your picture taken with the actors. But there's something very moving about it because it's out of your hands. I think that if you sell the rights to a film based on a book you've written, you are sort of saying to them, here, you're going to do a variation on a theme. And you let them do that. And they will do what they do. And I like seeing that. I'm somebody who loves movies, and so it's exciting to me to see that.
Well, I mean, again, Glenn Close in this movie is...
Yeah, she's amazing. It's a thrilling performance, I think.
Really, Dangerous Liaison level. And she doesn't have an Oscar yet, so I'm kind of gunning for that. You've 10 adult novels, but you've also written 2 young adult novels. And and your books almost always have, a significant multi-generational component. But I'm curious because those 2 YA novels are more sort of recent. Did writing those for a specifically young audience change how you approach writing the younger characters in your adult books?
I don't know. I don't think that it changed it, but I do like writing about young characters because adolescence in particular is a time of firsts. It's when things are happening for the first time, so they feel kind of electric. The Interestings followed a group of friends over time, over almost 40 years. This book has people of different generations looking at each other. Beljar, my YA book, young adult book, had a girl writing about the loss of her boyfriend, and it had a kind of breathlessness in her explaining her experience that I don't think I would have done, but maybe I would be freer to play with that a little bit more in the future. It's hard to know how one book really affects another. You never really know. In fact, the way The Wife came about, well, I don't know that I've even spoken about this so much, but I had been writing a book based on Freud's patient Dora. And I went to Vienna to research it. And I started writing it. I'd sold it and everything. I started writing it. And I realized that I felt kind of corseted writing in a voice that couldn't have the kind of wit that I wanted to have. So I put it aside. And then I wrote The Wife, which was kind of bursting out at the seams. It's like an angry, funny book. It's the first-person book that I'd published. And I think I wouldn't have written it if I hadn't had the experience of feeling frustrated by that other book.
Okay. Well, I keep telling people that, that the chaser for this book is The Wife before the film comes out, because it feels, as much as people keep saying the female persuasion is the book of the moment, The Wife really feels
There's a relationship, and somebody actually said to me, I think it was on Twitter, "Oh, haha, I see what you did referencing The Wife," and they showed me, maybe it was just on Facebook, I can't remember, that there was a line in The Wife in which somebody refers to people of the female persuasion. Yeah, you're nodding. You know that I did not remember that. I had to sort of pretend I remembered that. There was an episode of Saturday.
It's like the Marvel Cinematic
setting
Universe.
everything up. There was an episode of Saturday Night Live many, many years ago with William Shatner playing himself going to a Star Trek convention, and the audience starts asking him these really detailed questions from episodes, and he doesn't remember, and he's like, "I'm sorry, I don't remember," and they start turning on him, and his agent whispers something to him, and he gets back up there and he says, "Well, obviously, I was playing Captain Kirk from episode blah, blah, blah," where his brain is taken over or something like that. I sort of feel like I have to do that a little bit with things I don't remember in my own work.
And there are other jokes we could make about The Wife, but that would be giving away.
Yeah, no, there's a
plot.
thing in the book that
Don't read anything about it before you read it
about the
or
film.
see it.
Yeah.
Sorry. Speaking of Twitter, though, you are on Twitter, but I've heard you say that your view of the novel is that it's the opposite of a tweet.
Well, that's a line from Mary Gordon, actually. Yes, Mary Gordon said the novel is the opposite of the tweet. I think it's actually really a great line and true. And particularly in this political moment when, we are being just hamstrung as we watch my president. Well, he's not really my president. All right, I guess he is technically. But, tweet and say these things. But even the inflammatory rhetoric of, being of all caps or being limited to a number of characters. The novel, what I love about the novel is the things that are opposite of that. The idea, a novel can't go on forever, although some feel like they do, but it can expand to be as long as it needs and to explore, to be imbalanced, I guess, which is so great. Like, you don't have to play fair with all your characters. One character can get 5 lines, and then they're nailed in those 5 lines, and another character can get most of the book. And tweets come in and say what they want, and I think what is most difficult for me about them is that you can't revise, because revision makes a novel. Revision absolutely makes a novel.
You were writing this, the American election happened. Did you go in and revise anything? And again, without giving away, how did that, because I think I did.
Yes, so, okay, so, this novel, which starts in 2006 and deals with some of the pressing issues in feminism and talks about misogyny and opens with, this groping, this assault on campus. And now the conversation is so much around the men of the Me Too movement, the men who have inspired the Me Too movement. Inspired is not a great word there.
Yeah,
instigated it, catalyzed it.
Yes.
So I finished a draft of the book, and I think as I neared the end of the book, I imagined, of course, that the book would come out and we would have the first woman president. And to some degree, there would be a sense in the novel that one of the things that I would be sort of suggesting is that sometimes things get a little better for women, and then they get a little bit worse, and then they get a little bit better, but you keep going. But then I realized that once in a while, what I'd seen is that the whole tablecloth is ripped out from under you, as in a sort of magic trick. And while I don't want this book to be about this moment, I don't mean for it to be that. I hope that if you read it, you'll understand it as being about things that have been around forever. I mean, I really mean to be around ideas that even predate, what we know of second wave feminism even. But I called my editor because I needed to go back into the book and thrust my characters forward a little bit more into a more uncertain time, which is post-election. I don't use Trump's name. I don't use Hillary's name. I don't want this book to be attached to that just. And one of the characters refers to the time as the big terribleness. And yeah. And then even around that, there's a coalescing around women flooding politics and ideas. There's a young character at the very end who stands for the future in a way. And I loved writing about her and her ideas about what's happening. And essentially the optimism that you have to have to create social justice movements. There has to be, anger at things being unfair, but a sense of the possibility of imagining a world that you want to live in. And I have a very young character who does that at the end. So yes, absolutely went back into the book after it ended.
And you've not done that before?
No, I haven't done that before. I practically want to do that still now and go to your homes if you have the book and say, excuse me, may I make a few changes,
I think now's the time when I think that I'm supposed to open to questions from the floor. So there'll be a book signing afterwards. We've got about 10 to 15 minutes of questions if people have any. There's a microphone. We just ask that you go to the mic, question, comment, questions.
People are always a little
reticent to start. What did you make of the Nobel news, speaking of? Let's just talk about that, because there's a fictionalized...
I only saw the headline. I haven't read...
Okay.
I was traveling today, and I haven't read any details about it. What's your take?
Well, I don't know. I feel like there's a couple of Canadian authors who were maybe disappointed that there was no Nobel awarded
I will say
this year.
This to turn it back to me. The film of The Wife takes what had been this Helsinki Prize and makes it the Nobel Prize. And the film has a Swedish director, and it's part of it, a big part of it, much of it is set at the Nobels.
Yeah, if I were a reporter, that would be the number one phone call I would make today to the guy that directed that movie. Oh, come on. I see some of you in there. You surely have. Who's read the book?
Oh, God, now they don't want to say. Now no one has read it.
Now no one has read it. Everyone's pretending they haven't read it.
I've heard about it.
Okay, well, I have another question. It's kind of a specific question. It's because I noticed this in the interestings, but I really love the sort of texture that you invoke of a place with smell. And I was really overwhelmed by that in this book. The female Persuasion has, the dorm room, there's the spongy smell of the dorm sofas that is a thing that I don't notice in a lot. It doesn't happen in a lot of other novelists. They don't really know how to do it. I mean, Raymond Chandler does it really well. But is that a particular interest for you?
No one has ever said that to me. I did not know that about myself.
There's smell on every third page, the way, really.
Really?
It's evoked in prose in a way that I've not...
Well, it's funny because the original title was The Olfactory Persuasion, but I never knew that. That's right. And one of the couches smells like fried flounder.
Yeah, no, they're really wonderful. I have little lists of the ways they smell.
The thing about writing, and one of the many things about writing, is that you don't really know what it is you do until other people tell you. And that, case in point.
Yeah, look, there's the fictionalized sort of Axe deodorant body spray called Stadium.
Oh, yeah,
I hope it's fictional.
Part pine sap, part A1 sauce.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Right?
Well, the idea, as the mother of boys, the body spray was a big thing in our home for a while, right? Men and boys and body spray. So it just I guess what I think about that is whatever you can do to texturize your world is something you should do. Any process.